And I mean, if you think about mainstream, you're unlikely to be able to move from one university at one end of the country to another, perhaps as seamlessly as our offenders are going to be able to do in the future, to move with the records and the files through our core curriculum and our OLAS structure. So I think there's light at the end of the tunnel for getting it right and being able to continue the courses wherever you are without that specialisation. But the virtual campus, which is the e-learning portal that all prisons will eventually have access to, should give that degree of specialism for every offender. So I hope that's true. And if I could just perhaps go back and then leave it to Tom to finish, the genuine needs of offenders rather than tick box. I think it's something that as educators in prisons we've been struggling with that for some time. From the day that key performance targets came out, where we had to have a certain number of level 1s and a certain number of level 2s. And I fought that furiously when I found one of our education team running round a young offenders prison shouting, "Are there any level 1s? Are there any level 1s?" And the poor entry levels were being ignored because they needed another 17 level 1s. Now that was not addressing the genuine needs of that population. It was addressing the tick box. We've moved a long way since then, because what we do is do a needs analysis and then address that. We start with the need rather than start with the outcome. And if we start with the need and address that properly through a skilled workforce, yes, within the constraints of the budget and the contract, but if we start that way around, if we put the needs of the individual at the beginning, we'll get it right.
Thank you. Tom?
Just a very brief, 2 points really, I think, related. First of all, the tick box and the targets. I think there was a growing perception, I don't know about the prison sector, but more generally, that there have been a excessive emphasis on narrow targets, and the pendulum was already swinging. And I guess the political change should be, again, if you believe the rhetoric, that it will move further towards allowing discretion amongst the services. The other point I just wanted to make is that John Hayes, who's the Minister for Further Education and Lifelong Learning, I'm quite sure how the responsibilities work out, but he has begun his ministerial career by really making very strong statements about the breadth of goals for adult learning and how, in his view, they should not be tied only to qualifications or to seeking very specific outcomes, but they are to do with issues of social cohesion and of personal fulfillment. And I think his first speech is up on the NIAS website. And NIAS has trained him up extremely carefully in opposition to say these things, but I genuinely didn't get the sense he was just saying them as a sort of repetition. He put a lot of feeling into it. So that's just a note of optimism. But of course, then he needs to be talking to whoever his counterpart is in justice.
Thank you. I'm sure there are other questions, but we have a treat just before we stop for lunch that I'm keen to fit in. We're going to have a little bit of drumming from somebody who works in prisons and with drums, to drum us out to lunch. But before we do that, we have our final contribution for the morning, which is from John Bunner, if John wants to come up, presenting the other inquiry paper, which addresses offender learning and gives some very useful and pertinent statistics about the case for the wider benefits of learning, and particularly offender learning, that I think we can all use in different ways.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's very nice to be in the Institute of Education, where I've worked for very many years. I'm retired now, but it's just relevant, I think, particularly to this meeting today, because that's my job there, was to run large-scale longitudinal inquiries which follow through individuals from birth into adult life. And they're remarkable resources, unique in this country, in the world. And they're large scale, and they enable one to understand so much of how lives are created, led and developed. And I think they're extremely relevant to two aspects of what we're talking today. Lifelong learning, on the one hand, and of course the life course perspective that I want to draw into this talk today, which really enables us to put together almost everything we've been discussing and hearing about into one framework, which I think is terribly important for understanding where we ought to go next. And may I just say, glancing through the material in the pack, I thought it was an excellent set of prescriptions and activities that we're hearing about. Trust is actually engaged in another work too, and that has been enhanced further by, I think, by the talks from Tom and Mira. We're all on the same track, we're getting there. And of course the talks, the contributions from the audience, I think have enhanced, elaborated the details, the practice side. We must never lose sight of in how we actually implement ideas and principles in a real context, a real life situation. So what I'm going to do is simply try to not go into any details, there's not enough time, but just use the opportunity in introducing the paper I wrote for the inquiry, which has a lot of detail in it, but just to restate some of these principles that link together with what we've been hearing about this morning. And I think that's probably as much as I can do. I will leave some thoughts which people can then take up in later discussions during the day. So now I've got to just find the right place to press. Good, thank you very much. And I'm not, sorry, I'm too far away from the mic. Can people not hear me, or can you now? Yeah. Good, okay. Apologies for that. I won't repeat what I said, we're running out of time. What I've just written up here is something which looks a bit jargonistic, but I think really summarises so much of what we've been talking about. The first are these components of what we might call the life course, and a view of it and where crime, criminal behaviour and custody fits into it. That first we have trajectories through life. That word's been used, but also elaborated nicely through the discussions, I think, the notion of the learning journey, the notion of the conveyor belt. Just contrast those, a kind of very positive way of looking at life, or the trajectory, and the other, perhaps more negative, essence. But the main point we're making is that to a certain extent lives are predictable, and to understand what happens to an individual when they go into custody or are offending for the first place, one's got to understand the whole biography, the background that lies behind that activity, to fully understand what's going to be appropriate to achieve changes in it. I mean, the critical criminal trajectory, which of course parallels so many others, is one that shows a kind of predictability from certain circumstances of poor family background, poor experiences of education, learning difficulties, but also just failure to engage almost from the beginning of entry into primary school, into problems around gaining jobs, leaving school typically at a minimum age because of lack of skills acquired, into periodic and then almost permanent unemployment, then of course an alternative career structure offered through crime and offending, and finally what has been described, not used so much now, the idea of social exclusion, that this is just one of a multiple of problems, but crime is the sort of core of what enables the person to engage in ways of surviving through making money, and but look behind it and look what has happened in relation to the custody that occurs within it. And that comes on to the next key point, transitions. I think they've also been mentioned, but there are these critical points in life where the trajectory can move on in the negative or the positive direction. Leaving school, critically important. What happens? You don't get a job. You're drifting in and out of education for a bit. Then you've had the not in education employment.